Okay, we're all set for our next talk. This is another one I'm really excited about. This is Ashleigh Rentz, who was a presenter during our first conference in 2013 and again at Portland 2018. So apparently she's doing this every 5 years. She also started the Queer Tea meetups in 2015 that have become a yearly tradition here for LGBTQ plus documentarians, especially for first-time attendees who might otherwise feel isolated. That is amazing and so important to have here. Aside from doc, she's an out-of-practice scuba diver who hopes to get back in the water soon, and she occasionally creates music using vocal synthesizer software. There's a concert after the conference is over, I'm presuming, right?
I'm sorry?
Are you giving a concert later?
Hadn't planned to, but, you know.
Perfect. So with trauma-informed documentation, wow. Trauma-informed, don't do that. Taking empathy and inclusive language to the next level, please welcome Ashleigh to the stage.
Thank you, everyone. Obviously, trauma is not the easiest of subjects, so I'd like to start with just a few quick ground rules. The first and the most important one is if you need to leave the room, please do so. You will not offend me whatsoever. We will not be doing an on-stage Q&A after this talk either. I've put a great deal of thought into what I'm saying on stage, but I'm very happy to take questions off stage afterward. And I'll also be here this evening after the conference wraps up. I do live with PTSD. I've been through hundreds of hours of therapy, so I've learned things, but I am not a mental health professional. Please understand, I'm speaking up for other people. I'm not speaking for them. I can't even represent the entire trans community, never mind all the other groups I'm not part of. While I have the stage, I'll do my best to advocate for other people, but my voice is not the only one you should listen to. And finally, never tell marginalized people how to feel about language that affects them. Next up, I'll give you some quick content warnings. I don't know who else here has trauma or what it could be from. And some of these subjects are difficult for any compassionate person. So we will not go into depth on any of these, but we will briefly discuss alcoholism, anti-Semitism, bullying, COVID-19, HIV/AIDS, the Holocaust, Islamophobia, mass shootings, racism, slavery, substance misuse, traffic collisions, war, and the 9/11 attacks. Before I cover any of these topics, you'll see a box like that in the corner of the slide so that you know it's coming. We will divide my time up into 4 lessons. First, I will give you 2 extremely compressed lessons on trauma. Then we'll tie that back to inclusive language. And we'll wrap up with ways that you can advocate for other people and push back against some common arguments. So welcome to 101. And in this lesson, our job is to define what it is we're even talking about. What is trauma? The classic example is a soldier who comes home from war, and they've seen horrific things no human should ever have to. It can affect them so deeply. It's an extremely valid example, but there's a misconception that trauma always comes from these big, massive events. It can come from something more mundane also. The WHO, World Health Organization, gives us some examples of these, like an acute life-threatening illness. A heart attack can be traumatic. Or not even witnessing, but just learning about the sudden or violent death of a loved one can cause trauma. The Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Canada has a definition that I appreciate. They say trauma is the lasting emotional response that comes from living through a distressing event. It can harm a person's sense of safety, their sense of self, their ability to regulate emotions and navigate relationships. Long after, people can be dealing with shame, helplessness, powerlessness, intense fear. And I can vouch for that with a personal example. I used to be an avid bicyclist, but 8 years ago, almost to this day, a driver ran a red light at high speed and hit me. We believed that he was going about 55 or 60 miles per hour, or since I'm Canadian now, about 90. So the only reason that I can stand on this stage in front of you now is because I didn't enter that intersection as soon as I had a green light. For whatever random reason, I started pedaling a little bit later than I ordinarily would have. And because of that, the point of impact was my front tire and his passenger side door. If I had started pedaling half a second earlier, that would have been an unsurvivable head-on collision. When you knowingly come within a half second of your own death, it forever changes your sense of safety in the world. And I want to emphasize that trauma is a lasting response. Even now, 8 years later, and after a lot of therapy, when I'm driving and I see a driver charge through a light that just turned red, sometimes I still get that flood of stress come over me and can feel all the same emotions of anger and intense fear, even though I'm safe and even though there's no bicyclist anywhere nearby. That's what trauma does. I also want to point out that trauma and PTSD are closely connected, but they aren't the same thing. PTSD is a medical diagnosis. The American Psychiatric Association, the APA, defines it in their manual. The World Health Organization also has a definition used in much of the world. Today, I'll mainly talk to you about trauma. It's less medicalized, but even using the more strict criteria for PTSD, trauma is a lot more widespread than we might think. The APA estimates that almost 7% of adults in the US are going to experience PTSD in their lives. When you're living with trauma, the best known consequence of that is flashbacks. For a long time, I thought flashbacks were like hallucinations where you think you're back in the past again and reliving it. Now that can happen, but it's a very extreme example. Most flashbacks are a lot like what I just described that I feel at a red light. You experience all the same emotions again, even though there's no danger in the present. Psychology Today is a magazine. They aren't an authoritative source on anything, but I really appreciate how they describe the effects of trauma. They say, the amygdala become hyperactive. It overreacts to minor disturbances. There's an outpouring of stress hormones. You're living in defense mode, ever vigilant to the possibility of threat. And a lot of people experience problems with sleep or pain, turbulence in their relationships, or a diminished sense of self-worth. Now, we've been talking about trauma from one event that affects one person. Now let's expand our view a little bit. There's another type called complex trauma. Sometimes a person is subject to ongoing, repeated threats over time that they can't escape from. Maybe there's no one single event which causes trauma by itself, but the cumulative effect over time adds up and causes trauma. And I have another personal example of this. When I was growing up, I was bullied relentlessly in school. I mostly avoided physical abuse, but that came at a cost. I was constantly looking over my shoulders. I was very careful about where I went. Some days I took different routes to go where I needed to because of who was in my usual route. And no matter how badly I needed to use the washroom or the restroom, I didn't, because that is where violence was most likely to occur. So here we are today in a venue that's a converted school building. And trauma is a lasting emotional response. This is bringing up some of those old feelings for me. But this is also exactly why content warnings are useful. I knew about this well ahead of time. I decided on my own terms that I still want to be here today, and I prepared myself for it. Next, sometimes trauma doesn't happen to you, but it happens to someone you feel a kinship to, even if you've never met them. And if that group bond is strong enough, the trauma can ripple outward into a community. We call that collective trauma. An example most people will be familiar with is the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States. When that happened, for a lot of people, national identity is important to their sense of self, their sense of who they are. So this horrible thing happened, and they said, that happened to people just like me. My family could be next. There was extremely widespread hypervigilance afterward, which the government actively encouraged. There were outbursts of anger, very frequent. Sadly, but predictably, this led to a surge of racism and Islamophobia, and that sometimes turned violent, and it created even more collective trauma than there already was. These types of trauma can even combine with one another. So far, all of us here have survived the COVID-19 pandemic. It's killed almost 7 million people in confirmed cases alone, but the true death toll is closer to 22 million. I would be shocked if no one in this room loved one of those people. But even for the lucky ones like me who haven't lost anyone, we all still went through this very intense period where that horrible news could come at any time, and where simply going out to buy groceries for your family was potentially life-threatening. That's going to have lasting impacts on a lot of people. Some of us here today also lived through the peak of the HIV/AIDS crisis in North America, which was during the mid-90s. As a queer person, that was a really traumatic time to come of age. And the disease has killed 40 million people globally. And I want to point out, it is still killing hundreds of thousands of people every year, mostly in Africa, and most of those deaths are now preventable. We could prevent them if we cared more about human beings than about huge profits. It makes me angry, but our time today is short and I have to move on. Generational trauma is not recognized by the medical associations at this time, but it's the idea that trauma can be passed on to another generation, even if they're born long after the traumatic events occur. Some people think that there's a genetic component to it, but there's not solid evidence, and I'm really skeptical of that myself, but I do believe trauma can be passed down socially, and we can see that if we look at the Holocaust. This was undeniably one of the most widespread traumas in human history. Jewish people who lived through that faced intense violence and fear and threats that I can't begin to explain. Some of the survivors are still living and still carrying that trauma with them. Once the war ended, people who were born into Jewish families, they grew up in communities where a lot of the adults in their lives had no sense of safety in the world, and where they still experienced these symptoms of trauma long afterward. Intense fear, helplessness, undeserved shame, the list goes on. And kids can learn that trauma response from the people in their lives, and they can even pass it on to the following generation and experience another ripple of it down the line. But then we get something like the 2018 Pittsburgh synagogue mass killing. 11 people were murdered for simply existing. And it not only created new collective trauma, it reinforced that generational trauma as well. Okay, we're through the hardest part. How does all of this tie back to inclusive language? Inclusive language at a basic level is about creating a sense of belonging. UBC, the University of British Columbia, they say that it lets us avoid situations where we inadvertently or deliberately might exclude or dismiss or stigmatize people. And it helps us create respectful environments. There's a very, very simple reason that language has that power. Words mean things. But inclusive language is more important to that, and I'll give you 4 reasons why. The first is that trauma responses are very disruptive mentally. When one comes up, you can really get lost replaying old memories, experiencing the same emotions that you had before. It completely destroys your concentration. And there's no on-off switch here. It's stress hormones. It takes a while to get back to equilibrium. Second of all, problematic language has long-term effects. It's not like somebody just hurt your feelings one day and you get on with your life. It happens over and over and over again. And people take these messages and internalize them. And it can be a lot of negativity toward oneself or even self-hatred. The third reason is that a lot of us here have an inherited responsibility. I'm a white person living in North America. I'm the descendant of colonists who brutally decimated so many indigenous people, who enslaved Black people with such immense cruelty, and who committed countless acts of genocide. White people today are not guilty of the crimes of our ancestors, but we have 2 responsibilities. Number 1, it's our job to stop the ongoing abuses that are still happening today. And number 2, to mend the damage to whatever extent that is even possible. And while I have a microphone, I want to remind everyone, racism is not just a feeling or an opinion that some people have. It's a system. And sometimes we uphold that system without realizing it or meaning to. We have to pay attention. Inclusive language is not going to solve these problems. But what it can do is it can help us to stop normalizing racism. And then finally, there's a lot of value in intervention. Within a group, there's a lot of social pressure to conform, even if it's never spoken, even if people don't want there to be. People are reluctant to speak up. Maybe they feel like they don't have the authority to say something on the topic, or maybe they're worried about repercussions. But take a moment, see if you can think of a time in your life when someone came up to you privately and said, "I'm so glad you said something about that." And if you can think of something, do you think that other people may have felt the same way and just didn't say so? The good news is that it only takes one person willing to speak up to create an opportunity. But for marginalized people, there's so much pressure to sit down and shut up. People get tired of hearing us complain. They think we're oversensitive troublemakers. We need other people to speak with us. I like to remind myself that the problem with privilege isn't that I have it. It's that someone else doesn't. When we do have privilege, we shouldn't ignore it. We need to acknowledge it and use it for good. One of the most obvious consequences of problematic language is how the color black has become so closely associated with negativity. There are exceptions, but it's not the norm. And when you're getting all those messages over and over, it's terrible. So here in tech, most of you know this example, of course, but we have a white list of things we want to accept, and we have a black list of things we want to reject. But suppose you're learning English for the first time. Why does the color of the list matter? Why don't we have an orange list and a blue list? There's nothing inherently clear about these colors. They don't have an inherent meaning. They're just things that we have said over and over and over in social context. We keep saying white equals good, black equals bad. Human brains are very good pattern matching tools. So when we see that message often enough, our brain says, I'll just always assume that white is good, and I'll usually be right. And the same with black. This has real consequences. For white people, it makes racism harder to unlearn. But for black people, they get this degrading message day after day after day after day, which sure sounds a lot like complex trauma. What can we do instead? Well, we could try using traffic light colors, but even that's not ideal. First of all, the colors are still they don't have an inherent meaning. We just have assigned them a meaning over time. And also, the colors yellow and red have been used as racial slurs. I don't want to change who I'm hurting. I want to stop hurting people. So we need to think about, what are we actually talking about? What are we doing? We're making lists of things to allow or reject. Allow list, reject list. And thankfully, that's the direction our industry is heading in. I also see deny list and block list a lot. Also great alternatives. The key here is that these words inherently describe what we're talking about. You don't need social context, you just need a dictionary definition. Once more, say it with me this time. Words mean things. Now, it is impossible to make a list of all the problematic language that there is. And even if we could, people would argue endlessly about what should be included and what shouldn't. There's a reason that certain people are always demanding a list of what we can't say. They know that we can't give them a complete one. What we need instead is a strategy. We need some way to find these terms without just having to memorize a long list. Human brain, very good at pattern matching. So think about the problematic language that you know about, and a lot of it is indirect in some way, or maybe it's just not specific to the subject. Sometimes it's the opposite of a euphemism. We take something inoffensive and replace it with something horrible. Sometimes they're metaphors and similes. The pattern I'm seeing here is that we need to think about what our words mean literally. When the terms match this pattern, we can evaluate them. A lot of them will be perfectly fine, but some of them will be problematic. Sometimes we'll need to make a judgment call. So let's do an example. I'm going to put a paragraph up here. From a technical perspective, it's just complete nonsense. But would you raise your hand if you see a term here that you think might be problematic, but you're not sure? In the back, please, with the hat. Grandfathered, sure. Someone else? In front here? Sanity check. Sanity check, also good. Yes, one more. Blindly assume. Blindly assume. All of these are good, and this is my list, and I found problems with those. But there were some I didn't find problems with. In particular, red line surprised me. I was so hung up on the automotive use of the term that I completely forgot that it has a meaning to do with housing discrimination. And then payload, it can be associated with missiles or bombs, but we're clearly not using it in a destructive sense. And I wasn't able to think of a concise, different term to use. If I could think of one, I would probably replace it, but it's a judgment call. While I was developing this presentation, I ran into a perfect example of this. A few slides ago, I said that we can't just make a list of all problematic terms. This is the original slide I had there. But I got to looking at it, and I'm like, brute force seems a little indirect. If I need to make a reject list, I'm not going to use excessive physical force doing it. So I thought, well, I better look it up and make sure it means what I think. I look at the definition, and it's like, yeah, sure, that's very reasonable. That's exactly what I mean. But then I thought, I better look up the word brute as well. And when I do that, I see of or relating to beast, characteristic of an animal, cruel, savage, not working by reason. And I ask myself, what does that remind me of? That reminds me of slaveholders who argued very wrongly that slavery was okay because Black people weren't actually human. I have no idea if Black people associate the word brute with racism or not, but it doesn't even matter because as soon as I saw this connection, I want nothing to do with it. I choose a cautious and compassionate approach. Sure, that phrase might have been more linguistically interesting, but is that worth the potential for harming people? Of course not. So I find something else to say. Now, so far, we've mainly been talking about people who face discrimination, that is, who is most affected by problematic language. But let's take a look inward for a moment at the tech industry. This industry often pushes people to their breaking points. If I'm writing a tutorial and I take the attitude, this is fun, some of my readers are under a lot of pressure to get something done, and they might be at risk of losing their jobs. Others could be facing serious burnout. Then maybe at the end I put something like, you did it, crack open a beer and celebrate. Well, first of all, that already excludes my readers that have a religion that prohibits that. But also, some of my readers may be alcoholics, or they might have family members who are. Substance misuse is much more common in this industry than we like to acknowledge. In particular, stimulant misuse. I absolutely do not mean people with ADHD. I mean people who are under intense pressure to meet completely unrealistic goals and expectations, who push themselves way too hard because we're always celebrating the rock stars and the 10X engineers. Whether we know who they are or not, we have colleagues who are struggling, and they deserve empathy too. So what can we do about any of this? And I want to emphasize the word do. Not too long ago, I bought a pack of a lot of various pride stickers to share, but I'll show you what I did with the ally sticker. Saying that you're an ally is completely useless. What helps is to actually do something. So for example, if you want to ally with trans people, I will give you one of these Defend Trans Kids buttons. I've got tons of them. Wear it. And sure, maybe someone's going to get angry with you. So what? You might experience a tiny fraction of the hate we get for just existing. But the people in your life will know that you care, and maybe some of them will start paying attention before even more of these anti-trans laws get passed. It's the same with inclusive language. It's not enough to think that it's good. We have to use it every day. It's not easy to break our habits, and we will all make mistakes, but we can do it if we care enough. I want to ask every single one of you right now if you will commit or recommit yourself to practicing inclusive language every day at work and at home. Will you raise your hand if you'll commit to that? Awesome, thank you. That's our first step. We cannot advocate effectively if we don't even try to practice what we preach. Now, when we leave the conference and go home, if you're the only person in your company or your department that is practicing inclusive language, there's still value in that. You're still reducing the harm that goes out into the world. But it doesn't go very far all by one person. We need other people involved, and we need to start with awareness. Awareness is useful when people aren't even aware there's a problem. And there's something a lot of people aren't aware of. Say it for me this time. Yes. But awareness is also useless if we don't follow up. We need to give people something that they can do, even tiny things. Maybe what you do is you tell coworkers how you're practicing and invite them to join you. Maybe you give them a little reading material so that they can learn and be better educated on it. And when you do make a mistake, use it for good. Don't make a big deal out of it. Just correct yourself and move on. But in this example, somebody is going to see that who had no idea that tribal knowledge is a phrase that is cultural appropriation. Of course, not everyone will agree that this is worthwhile, but even that's an opportunity. Even if you can't convince that person, other people will hear you, and when they see your point and the fact that other people are pushing back, they'll understand there's more to do. Some common examples are people who say, "Why do I have to change just because someone else is sensitive?" Well, I can't make anybody change. But once they know a phrase is problematic, is it really that important to them? Who do they want to be? Or somebody might say, "I disagree that it's problematic. It originated from something else entirely." They might well be correct. But we are not walking human dictionaries. We interpret phrases with the context that we have today. And even if that's wrong, those assumed associations are still harmful. Then this one. No one at groups ever complained to me about saying this. Oh, the reasons. Maybe they've had bad experiences before when they've asked people not to say it. Maybe the phrase is so common it feels hopeless to ask. Maybe they're worried about rocking the boat and they've been told that they're too assertive. But of all the arguments, the one that bothers me the very most is this one. Avoiding it won't help you get over it. First of all, it is absolutely never our place to tell anyone else how to deal with their trauma. But even if someone does want to work through their trauma, exposure therapy is a real thing. I've been through it. You don't just throw someone into their trauma head first. It's a whole process. You build up to it very carefully. You discuss the scenario in great detail. You plan for all the different emotional reactions you might have. Just throwing somebody's trauma at them is not therapy. It's re-traumatizing. And if it's intentional, it's abusive. That was a lot of difficult material in 30 minutes. But if there's just one thing that you remember from it, we're all going to shout it together. Words mean things! And to make sure you remember, I have a ton of these buttons to give you. If you have a disability and can't rush up here, don't worry, I've got some saved for you. This topic is deeply personal to me, so I want to thank all of you so much, not just for listening, but for caring. This makes a real difference to me. Thank you.